I'd next like to introduce you to Scott Barrett, who is the Director of Resource Management in the South Coast region for the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations. Scott is a registered professional biologist and has been working in habitat management, project review, and species management for over 20 years in the British Columbian government. He'll detail a new web mapping tool, the Stewardship Baseline approach, that clarifies and communicates British Columbia's stewardship objectives for a number of priority environmental values. Take it away, Scott.
I'm going to actually just be showing you a tool that is currently under development within the South Coast here. I haven't sort of spelled out the specific applications for the private land, urban land development context, but I think some of that, I will discuss that a little bit further on, and hopefully some of that, some of this presentation triggers some ideas from those of you who are interested in that aspect of its application. And I'll explain some of the limitations. The first thing I want to do is manage some expectations here. So this tool is very much under development. It's not yet developed. We don't have a clear timeline for when it will be outwardly facing in government. However, and I'll talk about the timelines a little bit later on as well. But we believe we can start producing information that this tool generates within the next few months. And in fact, the information that is inputted into this tool is already available through our biologists, but just not as user-friendly as I'll present here. So I just want to talk quickly and give you some context about where we are within the province. So the province has really shifted towards more of a value-based approach to the management of natural resources. Essentially, there's three different types of values that we've identified. We have social values, economic values, and environmental values. So my group is responsible for really clarifying, at least within the South Coast, how we're going to be managing those environmental values. And so, you know, we've looked at this sort of the best way to divvy these things up, and for now we're describing there seems to be this alignment between you know, landscape biodiversity, things like seral stage distribution, forest conditions, and so on, and as they relate to specific terrestrial wildlife species. And then on the aquatic side, of course, the watershed conditions really drive habitat conditions for fish and other aquatic wildlife, such as reptiles, amphibians, and even small mammals. And of course, the animals themselves, so the populations and the animals are managed under the Wildlife Act. So if we look at how we actually manage that landscape biodiversity and watershed health, well, these are managed by other arms within our ministry in particular. And so this slide is just sort of demonstrating how we are integrating these various aspects, which was really the whole intent around the creation of the Ministry of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations, was to bring all these decision makers together, get everybody on the same page as to where we're trying to achieve for these different values. So the area on the left, I mean, this is what is largely managed by what we call the authorization side of the ministry. So this includes our districts and our forest managers, as well as our land managers. So the lands and forests really cover that, the terrestrial values, and then of course the forest managers also manage our watershed conditions along with our water allocation and water management group. And then my group, which is what we call resource management, we cover the right side of the chart. So traditionally we were called Fish and Wildlife and Ecosystems, and we've done some restructuring here in the South Coast to align with these sort of value areas. So we have a Terrestrial Wildlife Resources section, which is being led by Josh Malt, who's our section head, and then we have Fish and Aquatic Wildlife group, which is led by Christina Lenski. Some of you may know her as Christina Robbins. She just got married. So, but you'll notice that there's an overlap in the middle. So, you know, both authorizations and resource management are responsible for both informing and managing landscape biodiversity and watershed health. All right, so this next slide, some of my staff have accused me of having this tattooed somewhere on my body. But we kind of take this approach of managing our values using this sort of continuous improvement model, which is not a new idea by any means, but this sort of helps crystallize really the different elements of our work. So when we're talking about setting objectives, this is our species management objectives, land use planning, things like environmental flow needs under the Water Sustainability Act, our fisheries management objectives, and this is all hopefully getting rolled up in what I'll show you in a few minutes, the objectives mapping tool. Of course, assessment is ongoing. We now have a cumulative effects assessment framework that's being rolled out provincially and that we're implementing here in the South Coast. There are environmental impact assessments, some of which Stephen just described for the within the municipal boundaries. Things like RAR assessments, in-stream flow monitoring, groundwater monitoring. And this is not an exhaustive list, just to give you an idea of the different components. And then, of course, we manage towards those objectives using the Wildlife Act, using, obviously, land use decisions for the private land base, and water use decisions, including in-stream works and water licensing. So there's lots of us that are involved with all aspects of these. Of course, qualified professionals are involved in interpreting and in contributing to setting species management objectives, actually doing the on-the-ground environmental impact assessments and so on, and then also informing and being part of the permits that are required. Local governments also playing their role, particularly in the land use decisions, and impact assessments and land use planning, and then water authorizations, so playing specific roles, and of course my group as well. So we all kind of are contributing to this model, and really the idea here is that these three things need to be working together. So we need to demonstrate when we're doing an assessment, what are the objectives that we are assessing against, and how is that information going to be used to manage those resources, and so on, and how are the management of those resources informing or being informed by objectives and the assessment outputs. So this tool that I'm going to describe, what is it? So it's affectionately referred to now by our staff as SBOT, so it's the Stewardship Baseline Objectives Tool, and it's supposed to be a spatial account of the South Coast region's stewardship values and objectives. So in other words, what do we want the BC South Coast region to look like in 30 years? And show me on a map. So if we look back to 1792, this is a painting by an artist from Main Island it's called Vancouver, 1792. And this is a meeting of Captain George Vancouver and a couple other explorers, Valdez and Galiano, just off hopefully a familiar looking coastline. And this is what it looked like, well, today, so 224 years later. And so I guess the point here is that there probably wasn't a clear vision as to what this may look like in the future, and really we're recognizing the need to start casting that future spatially forward. What do we actually want this part of the world to look like in the future from an environmental values perspective? So that's what this tool is really focused on doing for us. So there's three components. So we want to clarify and communicate those stewardship objectives spatially. We want to be able to communicate how well we're meeting those objectives at any given point. And so this is intended to be a real-time update of things like inventory, effects assessments, species models, effectiveness monitoring, and so on. And then we want to make sure that this information is practical to our decisions, consultation, and advice. So make sure that it's actually relevant to the management decisions, both at a strategic level and where possible at an operational level. And so I've turned this first one red because this seems to be the part of the project that is probably the most important, but it's actually the one that is easy to step past. We tend to start focusing on the assessments, but we're recognizing the need for government in particular to take a leadership role in clarifying objectives, particularly for the Crown land base, but more broadly for Crown resources, including wildlife and water. So what does it look like? So I'm going to actually pull up the tool itself and give you some examples of what it looks like. So this is we've identified a number of values, and I'll actually give you the whole list a little further on in the presentation, but I'm just going to walk through some existing examples that we have completed or largely completed the development of this tool for. So each web map right now is developed for individual species. These are prioritized species within the region. We have about 33 values that we've focused on, and I'm going to show you some that will have relevance in different contexts. So the first one is the marbled murrelet. So this is a species at risk that is receiving a lot of attention as the federal government is interested in understanding how well the province is managing the forested habitat for this species. It is a species that depends on old growth environments for nesting platforms, and then it feeds on forage fish within the marine environment. So what we've done here is we've provided a bit of an explanation and background information on the species itself. And then, and I should say, when I was preparing to give this presentation, I found out from staff this morning that actually I'm presenting on an old, or I'm presenting an old version of this tool, that we have a new version as of this morning. And so that's a reflection of how this technology is constantly changing, but the content hasn't changed. But anyway, so the first thing we do is we want to clarify those objectives. So what are our objectives for this species? And so and objectives can be categorized into a number of different components. There could be legal objectives, non-legal objectives, species recovery objectives, and so on. And our plan here is to be able to communicate all of those objectives as well as we can, and so that we can give the decision maker as much information as possible to inform decisions given different contexts. So just to let you know, so the marbled murrelet, our objective here is to retain, it says here 70% of the 2002, so that's for basically the species generally, but for the southern mainland coast, which is the area that we're managing, the goal is actually to retain 85% of the modeled habitat over a 30-year period. So by 2032, we should have 85% of the habitat that was there in 2002. So this model, this web map allows us to look at a number of different elements across the land base. So we actually look at the modeled habitat that was there in 2002, and you can look at where that habitat is being depleted since 2002. And right now, I'm showing it for the entire conservation region. I'm actually going to just turn off a layer here. Oops. So I'm going to show this actually by landscape unit. So though the objective is not by landscape unit, we determined that landscape units are a meaningful management unit for our decision makers, for them to get a sense of impacts of proposed cut blocks. So we can look at individual landscape units around the region, and basically we're looking at those that are tracking well over the first 10 years of that, well now up to 14 years of that 30-year time period, and those that are not. So those that are tracking well are the landscape units that are green. Those that we are a little bit more nervous about in terms of the depletion rates are turning yellow, and then those that look like they're actually exceeding the targets in the recovery strategy are turning red. So we can actually, there's a number of different things, but this is an interactive tool. We can choose individual landscape units, and it will give us a sense of what the rate of depletion is. And these, actually this is for the whole unit. And I'm driving this thing, but I didn't build it, and I'm kind of a rookie driver. So I've been given the wheel, but I'm just trying not to crash it. So yeah, so these widgets here will actually show us what the rate of depletion is, and then including cut blocks that are proposed within that area. We can look at what proportion of the proposed or active cut blocks will impact on that, on the depletion rate for that species, or for the marlet. All right, so I'm going to show you another one. So that's one example. So now I'm going to open up a species that some of you may be familiar with, or more familiar with, which is the Oregon spotted frog. So this is considered by many to be Canada's most endangered species. And you'll notice that the objectives for the species are described quite differently, and so the web map application itself really reflects that distinct nature of the species and how we're setting the objectives for it. So the recovery objectives for spotted frog are really more focused around population recovery versus specific habitat, though there are habitat objectives included as well. And so far in what we've developed for this species, it's more focused on, again, on those population objectives. So we can look at individual population units, and again, we have a number of different widgets that will describe the status. And so we can look at the broader recovery team objectives of having 10 healthy habitats. To meet the recovery objective, we currently have 7, and then it gives us some historical context and so on. So you know, we're sitting at 7. This is a species that we've had some recent good news in terms of finding new species, or sorry, new populations, and we hope that that trend continues, and that we, however, if we look at some of the more detailed data on the individual populations in terms of things like the egg mass counts, so some of them we don't have a lot of data, we just started collecting information. Other populations such as Morris Valley, we have a little bit more information. And then species we've known, or populations we've known about for a long time, such as mountain slough. And so, and we have specific egg mass count objectives for these populations, and we can figure out whether or not we're meeting those objectives or not. And so, particularly here in mountain slough, we are concerned that we're not meeting our 125 target for egg mass counts within a given year. And this allows us to summarize that information or communicate that information quickly and clearly, and obviously is interactive to allow folks to search for populations that are particularly relevant for the area that they're managing. Okay, I'm going to flip to one more example. All right, well, I may have to just describe this one. So this is looking at, we have modeled hydrological metrics for a number of different watersheds within the region. So it looks like it's come live again. Presenter's worst nightmare. Basically, we've looked at the hydrometrics for a number of different watersheds, and obviously the map is still incomplete for the South Coast area, and we're currently trying to fill in these goals, or in these gaps. But we're looking at basically watersheds across the entire region, and again, calculating a number of different flow metrics, and then looking at, based on the current flow allocation within each of those watersheds, what the risk assessment or risk rating would be in terms of further flow allocations. And we have a number of different categories that we've set up to evaluate that. And some of the technical elements of this I'm not as familiar with, so we have a hydrologist that has been developing this for us, but you kind of get the idea. We look at a specific watershed, we can evaluate a number of different modeled flow characteristics, everything from mean annual discharge through to things like the 7-day low flow. And this is specific to the month selected. So we can sort of toggle our way through the different months in the year and look at what the risk rating is for any further flow allocation within that watershed. And of course, this is relevant to everything from domestic water licenses to clean energy projects. And these risk ratings would determine just the amount of scrutiny that may be applied to a specific water license application, or in some cases us suggesting that that watershed is fully allocated and we really can't permit any further licensing of water. So yeah, I'll flip back to the presentation, just go through a few more slides, and then we can open it up for some questions. So we've identified the following values as a priority one. So what we're working on is a spatial display of both the objectives and the assessment of these by this coming March. So this is serial stage distribution, and you'll notice that some of what we have in brackets are provincial CEF assessments. So these are values that have been identified provincially to be completed for a cumulative effects assessment framework, and we will be basically inputting that information into this model, or into this web map application. So we have serial stage distribution, old growth management, grizzly bears, Roosevelt elk, northern spotted owl, northern goshawk, spotted frog, painted turtle, marbled murrelet, watershed condition, which is essentially looking at the risk rating of a particular watershed based on a number of metrics around things like road density, equivalent clear-cut area, and riparian integrity, mountain goats, tall bugbane, and phantom orchid. Oh, and black-tailed deer. And then for priority 2, so these are values that we've committed to communicating the objectives for them by March. Within the web map, there's water quantity, white sturgeon, wolverine, Pacific giant salamander, riparian integrity, Pacific-tailed frog, bull trout, dolly varden, and rainbow trout steelhead, and cutthroat and kokanee. And then species that we're looking to have qualitative but non-spatial display of objectives this year are screech owl, great blue heron, red-legged frog, cutthroat showed up twice here, rare aquatic plants, gray wolf, and snowshoe hare. Water quality, and then other values and layers that we are including in the model, as I just showed you, flow allocation, protected areas, and then what we call the constraints layer, which is similar to a protected areas layer. So that's it for I do have some other slides, but I think that's probably enough information for now. The one thing I would say is that in the context of the private land, urban land development base, the province does not have, has not invested as much in the development of geospatial information, and obviously we're not the primary land use authority on private land, and local governments have a number of different tools, and as Stephen presented earlier, I think part of the reason that I agreed to be part of this and wanted to be a part of this webinar was really to, I guess, get local governments to some extent thinking about how we could partner better in communicating objectives, both land use objectives and environmental objectives spatially, and I guess even posing the question as to whether or not that is something that we would consider to be beneficial in the management of environmental values on in the private land base and with local governments.
Thanks, Scott, for introducing the stewardship baseline approach. It sounds like another great tool for local governments to gather species at risk information to make more informed land use decisions. Next, we will have a question and answer period. I will turn on all the mics, and Pamela will ask any of the questions that participants are sending in.
Thanks very much, both of you. Really appreciated having those presentations. I think it just gives a bit of a broader understanding that when we're talking about the species at risk story for the province of BC or anywhere in Canada, that there's a lot more broader applications that we actually need to consider. So we have two questions. Now, one of the first ones was, is it possible to get a copy of Stephen's slides? So we'll be discussing with the presenters about making their PowerPoints available. Just so that you know, this session is being recorded. We have a YouTube channel, so the SCCP has its own YouTube channel, and Christine will be sending out the link for the actual webinar when it's posted up to our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to review it at that point in time. We normally split it up so that the webinar is broken into 2 parts based on the presentations. The second question is, the tool Scott is presenting internal to government, or will it be available more broadly to QPs, municipalities, etc.?
Right now we are developing it internal to government. The latest version that I didn't show you does have a report out function, so we can generate essentially PDF reports from querying the information. All of the information in the tool is publicly available, but obviously not in a web map form. We are working as aggressively as we can to move this forward to an outwardly facing tool. Obviously, some of the information requires quite a bit of interpretation, and so there's a little bit of nervousness about just having sort of all of the raw information available to everybody, but I anticipate that is the direction of government, is more and more, and we're hearing that from the highest levels in the organization, to get information out and available to the public. And we
Excellent.
just need to demonstrate how we're meeting policy to do so.
I know from a user standpoint, it's very handy to have all of the data actually sort of portaled or warehoused in one central area, so that a lot of the background work's already been done, and then the ability to actually just go through it, it provides a lot of help as a decision support tool, to be able to just click on and off data layers to sort of try to answer the questions that are most pertinent to your particular audience or to your organization. So obviously having it is kind of like a central portal system that the public or decision makers or municipalities can access, I think would be really a great opportunity to pursue. And a question for Stephen. Given the public benefit of protecting green infrastructure, has there been any exploration of financial incentives and or cost sharing to offset private costs of sensitive ecosystem protection?
Yeah, there's right now we're developing a financial strategy for ultimately the purchase of the biodiversity conservation, green infrastructure, and network lands. There's a whole host of funding abilities. It's just whether or not there's a political appetite to impose those onto the public. So we're looking at all different types of models. There's lots of local governments in North America that have skinned this cat in all different ways, but ultimately it would be taxing at some level. So we are investigating that stuff, and we're hopefully going to have something for Council's considerations at least, or to let Council advise staff which direction they feel is best to go, probably within the next 2 months or so. The other aspect of it is, with our development permit areas, is if you follow our setbacks, then it's the path of least resistance. And we forego a bunch of requirements that we used to require in the past. So in the past, when an application conveyed lands to the city, let's say riparian, we had them bring that area up to park standards, so it would be invasive free, replanting, all that kind of stuff. That was what we called our P15 policy. If applicants convey the lands as per our setbacks, then we're foregoing any of those costs that they would normally have. So at this point, we're not incentivizing them by giving them money to do things. We're incentivizing them by not giving them costs and charges that we have been giving to them in the past. Other things that are also up is part of our land use planning. We use clustering and density bonusing as a strategy. Now, I caution that because that only works when the applicant is looking for higher density. And in Surrey's perspective, a lot of the areas, they are looking for higher density for townhouse and condo and things like that. but there are some parts of our city where single family is king. So density bonusing or clustering isn't an incentive to the applicant in those areas. So we are looking at some options, but at this point it's more of offering them a streamlined process, path of least resistance, as well as not needing to hire as many QEPs if they stick to our development guidelines and zoning setbacks. If people have any other questions about our perspective or you know, things that are going on here, feel free to shoot me an email.
All right. Well, we have some latecomers in. All right. One for Stephen. Do you give tax receipts for property that is being dedicated?
No, there's no receipts. It's just part of the development application. So when they come in for a rezoning subdivision, they would then subdivide off the parcel that is being conveyed. Typically, applicants that are sophisticated realize that conveying the lands that are not developable are in their interest. There's nothing worse than a strata owning all of the forested area in and around these creeks that then they have to manage in the future, and that management might have to be dealing with some of their erosion issues or slope stability issues, or dealing with hazard tree management, or urban wildlife that are two-legged people that move in. So we get a lot of squatters that move into these areas. Yeah. So they quickly understand that conveying the encumbered lands is usually in their best interest.
Stephen, has there ever been any discussion about employing the riparian tax credit that is enabled under provincial legislation?
Not that I'm aware of, but I know we are investigating everything financial in regards to biodiversity retention and things as part of our financial strategy. So we'll be looking at all sorts of things, you know, like off the deep end. Like one way to get lands is to, you know, develop a financial strategy, actually purchase it. But there's lots of other ways that we're pursuing on the softer side of things, like stewardship, or you know, gifting through the federal ecosystem gift program. So we're looking at all options.
Okay, excellent. Next question, and this one's for Scott. Reference was made to retaining 85% of the habitat space based on 2002 information. Is intention to maintain this actual area, or is this a representation of a sliding scale, i.e. save 85% for 2010, etc.?
Yeah, so it's that just reflects the 30-year time frame that the recovery strategy was developed for. So it's a time-bound recovery strategy. So I mean, I can't imagine that in 2032 we would say, well, you know, we've lost 15%. We'll lose another 15%. And keeping in mind that forest management has to consider serial stage. So, you know, some of the habitat, there may be habitat coming online over that time frame that is currently not considered to be functional for the murrelets, and may become, and probably not large portions of it, frankly, but there may be some areas. And we see that with spotted owls as well. When we look at the trend analysis over time, we're actually seeing increases in habitat availability both over the last 20 years and over the next 20 years. But we're really living with a legacy of, in the South Coast and probably for the whole coast of BC, past logging practices.
Right.
And that's specific to that recovery strategy, that specific target.
One of the things that I noticed on the map that you showed, is it based on watershed boundaries? How are those polygons?
No, those are landscape units. So that's okay. So it's a number of watersheds within each landscape unit.
So one of the things that I noticed as you get closer into the southwest corner of the South Coast, as an example, marbled murrelet and northern goshawk are often an issue when we're having conversations with local governments, because when they look at the critical habitat polygons, like, they're telling us right out front, well, that's been developed. And obviously that has a lot to do with the currency of the data, and I'm glad to see that you're looking at kind of shifting that baseline based on real-time information versus 2002 benchmark. Although I guess the troubling part is it does give us an idea in the 14 years what has been lost, even with SARA being enacted, because of that lack of critical habitat mapping and sort of that engagement process until recently. But has there been any consideration about actually creating more fine-scale mapping for the baselines? Because for areas like the North Shore municipalities, as an example, it's a huge polygon, and yet the urban area is lumped in with that, which sometimes gives you a bit of a false understanding about habitat connectivity and baselines there.
Yeah, for sure. I would suggest that we have limited the current values that we have assessed, and certainly the ones that I showed today, other than the flow data, has limited application right now in the urban landscape, in part because we don't have within the provincial geographic database a lot of that, well, like you say, finer scale information that we would need in the urban land base. We are working on that, but we probably will need to work more closely with local governments in incorporating that information into our database. The other thing is that currently the thresholds that we've set for a lot of the provincial values for things like watershed condition, I guarantee you that all of the watersheds, I shouldn't say all, but most of the watersheds within, for instance, Metro Vancouver will exceed even, you know, the worst case scenario thresholds that we have within our cumulative effects, just because of the scale of development that we have within those watersheds. So we have to consider, well, then what are realistic targets for those watersheds? And that's something, again, that we need to work with the land use authorities to determine. So what should what is an achievable watershed condition for the Serpentine River, for instance?
Right, and it'll vary obviously depending on land use. You know, between Surrey, Coquitlam, and the District of North Van, very different types of pressures happening. The next two questions will be for you as well, Scott. The next question is, I noticed mention of grizzly bears. What is the plan for those?
That's a pretty broad question.
Hot button one.
So we have completed a grizzly bear cumulative effects assessment for the province. And it incorporates a number of different things again, so a number of different metrics, including, well, primarily metrics that drive mortality risk. They also incorporate the specific population unit status. So all of the 4 or 5 population units that we have within our region are either threatened, are identified as threatened right now. But, you know, and some of our population data collection is trending upwards for a couple of those population units. One is kind of flatlined, and then the other one is not doing so well at all. And so, yeah, and then we've basically been able to identify where the risk areas are for grizzly bears within the South Coast. I mean, what's interesting about this, we're receiving a lot of effort, or a lot of, I would say, pressure in government to do recovery planning for grizzly bears, and there's concern about exactly how we would do that, but we're viewing this tool as sort of the next best thing, in that we can communicate what our population and habitat objectives are for grizzly bears in the South Coast. And that information is essentially completed for our population units right now.
Thanks. And I think it's important to remind people that for that, we were just talking about the South Coast.
That's correct.
Right.
But the assessment for the bears is actually, for grizzlies, is actually done for the whole province.
Right.
That has been completed. Okay. What is slightly counterintuitive is that the risk ratings for grizzly bears is actually better in some of the southwestern parts of BC than it is for the northern parts of BC, which isn't. It's certainly raised some eyebrows.
So they're at lower risk than other areas like northern BC?
In some cases, yeah.
Right. Is that got to do with hunting regulations by region?
Yeah, it's to do with hunting, but also to do with development pressures. resource development pressures.
There is a part B to that question. They're expanding their range. This is Wendy, who lives on the Sunshine Coast in Seashell. So she says that they're expanding their range into my backyard in Seashell. How are we going to protect them? And I guess the same would go for the Upper Pit and Squamish as well.
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges for grizzly bears, particularly for the Garibaldi Pit population unit, and to some extent for the Squamish Lillooet, is that we are seeing bears moving into more heavily developed areas now, and you know, frankly, we have to make some tough decisions about where exactly we do want to see bear populations thrive, given, you know, some of the inherent human wildlife conflicts that will emerge as a result. So, yeah, I would say that we don't precisely know what our objectives will be, but I mean, similar to black bears, you know, at some level, we won't be tolerating them in suburban and urban landscapes, and so we gotta, you know, we may be in the business of relocating some of those animals over time.
Okay, that's for a whole other webinar, I think, to get into that discussion. We can have a specialized one on large carnivore management at some point. Next question, and this will, I guess, be our last question. Has or will the province compile and share with local governments a list of professionals who are qualified to assess effective protection for species at risk? That's actually a very good question. We get asked that a lot with our meetings with local government.
Sure. So, and I know Stephen alluded to this earlier about this question of effective protection. So the province does not have a position on what is considered to be effective protection under the Species at Risk Act. That's a federal question, frankly. And I think, you know, one important clarification, maybe most of the people on this webinar know this already, but it's something I often clarify when we're talking about the Federal Species at Risk Act. Under SARA, the staff within the federal government are not in a position to consider social and economic interests when they're making decisions around what is effectively protecting a species or its habitat. The consideration of social and economic interests and concerns is made at the very last step in the federal process, when, if it's determined by staff and ultimately the Minister of Environment federally that a species or its habitat is not being effectively protected, then they are to issue an order, and then that order is considered, is to be, I guess, ratified by the federal cabinet. And I'm sure I'm getting a lot of the terminology here wrong, but it's only at that point, when it goes to the federal cabinet, that those social or economic interests are considered. From the provincial perspective, we do that role of considering those other interests is delegated down as low as possible into our organization. So our statutory decision makers have to make that call earlier on in the process. And so, in other words, we're not necessarily making a call from a scientific perspective as to what is effectively protected. And so, therefore, we're never really in a position to recommend specific qualified environmental professionals. We don't view that to be the role of government, but that's the role of independent organizations such as the College of Applied Biology, you know, to determine who is qualified to do what within a profession. So yeah, but specifically around this question of effective protection, we don't know precisely what that means. We're trying to get a better understanding of it from the federal government, but we don't know.
I know, Stephen, do you want to add anything to that? I mean, you're dealing with it sort of at an operational level. Certainly, there's situations where the city itself is dealing with having this. You're a QEP, like an RP Bio yourself, so certainly there's a number of local governments that don't necessarily have the luxury of having accredited staff internally within their organization, and the same would go obviously for a number of other land use interests out there.
Yeah, the way that we're dealing with it is dealing with the riparian area regs and the QEPs in association with that. It's been a grab bag of experiences as to the quality of the reports and whether or not, you know, like under the College of Applied Biology, it's a self-assessment of whether or not you're qualified. I think in the past that has been pretty loose when it's come to RER, and there's been lots of, I got some very poignant examples of, you know, biologists saying that they're QEPs and putting their foot forward, and when in fact it's probably best that they're not. I think there needs to be, I'd share Scott's sentiment in this, that I would point the finger back at the college to better define what that is, or to have a better demonstrable ability by the QEPs to show that they really are QEPs. But from my perspective, since I'm RP Bio, I have no problem going head-to-head with someone if I don't believe that they're demonstrating enough, or I just require that they demonstrate further that they really are qualified. I think when it comes to species at risk, these are pretty niche little animals. So, you know, how many Pacific water shrew experts are there that could quantify the various nuances in quality of habitat, or, you know, Oregon forest snail, or, you know, identifying some plant species? Like, my concern is that the pool of which you can draw QEPs from is pretty small. So it may be difficult to retain QEPs in a timely manner to get investigations done or reports done, as well as, you know, there could be a bit of a monopoly in, you know, a pool of QEPs as to, you know, getting reports done not only timely, but in an economic fashion as well. Because some of these things, it could be a single family homeowner who just wants to build their garage, and, you know, now they're on the hook for a $25,000 study. So I think those are sort of issues that we're seeing here. But ultimately, if the QEP wants to sign off the report, then we're kind of riding their credentials in on it. Whether or not it's enforceable, there's very few times where I've seen you know, a professional really held on their ear if they've, you know, recommended things that just aren't appropriate. But the way that Surrey deals with it is, if I believe that they are QEP and they're putting their recommendations forward and it seems like it's in an orderly fashion and reasonable, then we just ride their credential in on the report. So that's basically how Surrey's dealing with it.
So, Pamela, I have one more comment on that. So we are, as a province, we're increasingly and have been increasingly relying on qualified professionals to provide advice to statutory decision makers. And as much as possible, I'll describe it as unfettered or uncritiqued reviews or information. So, and one of the ways that we do that is that when we're, for instance, asking a QEP for information on a clean energy project, and we want to know whether or not there's impacts to a particular species or value, is we do describe to the QEP in the questionnaire we provide what we believe a qualified professional, you know, for that species, whether it's wolverines or rare plants or whatever, the amount of experience, the knowledge that they would have, the type of work that they've done to be an expert, to be qualified to provide the answers that we're about to ask. And then we ask them to confirm whether or not they have that experience or not. Now, that doesn't mean that if they say, no, I don't have that experience, but I still think I'm qualified to answer these questions, that's just information for the decision maker. So if they say, well, I've never, you know, I haven't, you know, I'm going to give you answers on wolverines, but I've never actually seen a wolverine, or I've never done any work with them, then that's information for the decision maker to go, well, we do have we have a professional here, so someone who's accountable to a college or association, but they're, you know, they don't actually have the background or credentials that our internal staff would recommend they have. So that becomes a decision for the decision maker as to whether or not they're going to rely on that information or not, or ask for more information, or get a second opinion, and so on. And then it also allows us, you know, if they provide advice and or say that they're qualified, and it turns out later that they clearly were not qualified, then that allows the province to essentially, lodge a complaint with the college. And this is someone who's misrepresented themselves. But quite often what happens in these reviews is that we don't specifically ask that of the QEP. We don't specifically ask them, how are you representing yourself? What are your qualifications? And I think it's a really important question for decision makers to be considering, rather than just looking for the letters after their name.
Great. Thanks very much, Scott and Stephen. These are the types of questions we get asked when we're doing our work with local governments, and it certainly comes up in some of the broader work that the SCCP does with the public as well, especially stewardship groups and conservation interests across various regions. One of the things that we often suggest to various audiences is to be more astute and ask questions. Definitely there are mechanisms, at least for local government, to perhaps want to do some auditing, although obviously there's liability and risk issues involved with that, and that's probably one of the inhibiting things that local governments deal with in regards to taking on the responsibility of quality assuring any work that a QEP submits. We are, as an organization, the SCCP is working on a critical habitat decision support tool right now, which is focused on private land. We want to fill in that type of gap and help address some of these questions that are coming up from landowners, but also how local governments can approach these issues. So that's in the pipe for us right now. It's something we'll be working on for the foreseeable future, and when that's available, we'll be making sure that it gets widely distributed, and we will be doing some implementation testing with the City of Surrey because of the work that they've been doing already on critical habitat. And I would just add that we have one piece of judicial precedent set with the actual safety net order that was invoked for the western coarse frog in Quebec, and that was on private land. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out and some of the details that come out of that with the various layers that were involved, both provincially, then municipally, as well as the professionals that may have been involved in that particular case. So there's a lot that's happening right now, and I think that just points to the fact that this is finally becoming more on the radar of land use decision makers across Canada, and for the SCCP, that's an important opportunity for us because the fact we are focused very much working with local governments and regional districts here on this issue.
Thanks, Pamela, and I would like to thank again our speakers, Stephen Godwin and Scott Barrett, for taking the time to share your knowledge, projects, and experience. Thank you for your continued efforts for Species at Risk. We would also like to thank the Real Estate Foundation for providing the funding for this webinar. We will be posting the webinar to the South Coast Conservation Program website at sccp.ca. Thank you for joining us as we explore and discuss Species at Risk baselines. Please get in touch with me if you have any further questions or seek to work with us to increase protection of species and ecosystems at risk. My email is conservationplanner@sccp.ca. Next webinar in our Species at Risk series is scheduled for sometime in February. Stay tuned. That's a wrap.